Hi, welcome back to the second session of week 7. As you already know, we have to do two more things before we move into a new topic. And let me one more time emphasize that both of these things that we're going to talk about are not in the book. They are implied, or at least the first one is implied in the book. The second one is not in the book at all. So this is very much related to the tables that we were able to calculate in the earlier session for given a supply of an exhaustible resource, a demand curve, a discount rate, and then we'll be able to find out what is it that is the optimal prices. What I mean is very simply is the following. So let me try and repeat before I show you a stylized diagram. Let me first go over this because I want to make sure that it is very clear for everyone. What we spoke about this morning was essentially the following. It's not important to use the same figures, but I'm going to use more or less the same figures. We said that given a demand curve, let's assume that we are talking about the P is equal to 40 minus 2Q. Is that showing there? Okay. And we said that the discount rate was going to be 10%, that the supply was 45, and if I'm not mistaken, the calculations allowed us to come to something similar to this. There's no need really to put all of them, but let me just recapture the spirit. So we said the price is going to be 20, 22, 24.2, 26.6 and so on and so forth up until 40, and the quantity was going to be 10, 9, 7.9, 6.69, etc. until 0. So what do we have over here? Notice this gives us a demand curve, so we will have a demand curve as such, right? When the quantity is 0, the price is 40. When the price is 0, what did we calculate the quantity to be? 20, right? So this is right now a demand curve. What is this if you're going to go ahead and plot it? You're saying that if this is time, during the first period, whatever it is, this is over here time, it's going to be 20. During the second period, it's going to be 22. During the third period, it's going to be 24, and so on and so forth, right? So let's assume that this is 20. So what do you have right now? This is the price. So given this demand curve, given this supply, given this interest rate, the discount rate, you will be able to predict, if all of these things are going to hold, you'll be able to predict that the optimal price path for the future is going to look like this. And this is really nothing else but these. Now, how do you know that it's optimal? That's the point. We know that it's optimal if by the time we get to this price of 40, the demand would be 0. We would have really used all of the quantities, the 45 of them. So by the last, when we lift the last drop of oil, we will pay that highest price, and that's it. Now the question is, how is it that we're going to avoid having a crisis? So you want to be able to shift seamlessly from this into a renewable. But in all cases, if you have the choice, then you would rather use all the oil that you have prior to the shift. And so it is very important, therefore, what sort of a price you're going to have in the marketplace that will determine whether you're going to be able to extract all that particular oil. One more time, I really have nothing against Saudi Arabia. Actually, probably I do, but this is neither here nor there. The important thing is that if you were going to be in charge of the oil ministry in Saudi Arabia, and you know that Saudi Arabia's wealth lies totally in the oil under the ground, and that there is enough oil for the next 300 years, would you want the world to go ahead and shift to a substitute in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? Of course not. And that's why in all of these international negotiations, including Paris and Copenhagen, the major obstacle was not only China, although China acted a little bit of an obstacle prior to Paris. The real obstacle was always Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't have an interest. Logically, if you were in charge of Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't have an interest in shifting away from oil. And that is precisely why it is very important for them to find that particular price that will prevent the world from shifting to a substitute. And that is very simply, I mean, obviously it's simpler said than done, but very simply is to find a reasonable switch point and to keep the price of oil below that switch point. I mean, if the world is going to go and switch totally into renewables, say when the price of oil is $125, then you've got to maintain the price of oil below $125. If you don't want the world to go ahead and extract oil from the tar sands in Canada, let's assume that the tar sands cannot be extracted except at $80, then you will keep the price of oil at $60 so that the tar sands of Canada will not come to the market, and so on and so on and so on. Now, the next step which I want to talk about, which is a little bit more complicated than this because you might not have seen it before, actually I'll be surprised if many of you have seen it before, it will be to take these four, that diagram that I put up here, and try and create a diagram that will show how is it that we can calculate this particular optimal point. Now let me show you this. I've already done it for you so that you will be able to look at it and hopefully it will be clear. Now what is this? This is the demand curve. So notice, by the way, let me just put them on the blackboard, or on the board again. So if this is the demand curve, now you take it and flip it over. So this becomes the demand curve. The price, which I had also suggested over here, this is time and this is the price, will be, so you take this and flip it over, because over here you're measuring dollars in both cases. So these become like this. Now, if this is, let's assume quadrant 1, quadrant 2, let's call this quadrant 3. Quadrant 3 is nothing else but a 45-degree line. Because you want to be able to take a reading over here and transform it to this. So any reading over here is the same as this, and this is this. Because a 45-degree line, by definition, is the line that's going to bisect this particular sector. Now, all what we have to do is take different readings. So what do we find out? We find out, for example, that when given this particular price, right, then the quantity demanded is going to be this. That will be this particular time period, and then we'll be able to come over here. This isn't drawn to scale, and this will be a particular point, and this will be another point. So this will represent all the quantity extracted. So all of this quantity extracted must be equal to the quantity that you started with in order for this to be an optimal price line. If this was here, then it would be completely different, because the price, right now you'll extract less. If the price line started from here, you'll extract more. So what I was suggesting this morning is that simply what we have done in the world is that we have started from here, from a very low price of oil 70, 80 years ago. And this is one of the reasons why is it that we have extracted so much oil. Why is it that we have developed an economy that is totally dependent on oil. So one can take, one more time therefore, one can take the things that we have spoken about earlier and put them together in a graphical diagram to show what is it that we were trying to show. And so you'll take different readings, whereby over here you'll wind up with the quantity extracted. And if there is a way of measuring it, if this is done correctly, then this, once the quantity extracted, by that time you would have gotten to the particular switch point. You would have used the 45 by the time you have gotten to the 40. But if you wanted to switch at a lower price, then definitely you will have to use a completely different starting point, because you would like to be able to use all what you have by the time that you get to that particular price. So the optimal price path is a graphical representation of the algebra that we worked out earlier, given the discount rate, the quantity and the supply, and given that they're going to be constant, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? Now, if this is clear, and I hope it is, then it's time for us to do only one more quick thing. In order to do that, the diagram, as I said, can be overwhelming the first time you look at it, but it really is very simple. Before I show you again, I have done a stylized diagram that will probably give you a better idea than just drawing it on the board. Let me review to remind some and to make it clear to the others, how does the market work when you have a non-perfectly competitive firm? You will normally have a demand curve, and the point of equilibrium is always when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. It isn't difficult to have a marginal cost. Let's assume, and we're going to assume for this particular model, that the marginal cost is going to be a straight line and constant. So really it's a very simple thing. So the only difficulty here is that where is the marginal revenue? The marginal revenue, as I hope all of you know, but in case you don't, that's why I want to remind you of it, always and forever, is this line. So this is marginal revenue. It bisects this distance under the demand curve. So if this is, say, 10, this will be 5. Now, there's a marginal cost. So where's the marginal cost? Let's assume over here that this is the marginal cost. So where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost, that will be the output. So this will be Q sub E. This will be the equilibrium output. And the price will be up here, P sub E. Always and forever. Whenever you're not faced with a perfect competitive firm, this is it. So you have demand curve, you have marginal revenue, you have marginal cost. And in this case, we're going to assume that the marginal cost is constant and is linear in order to make it easier. So what is it that we're going to be talking about right now? I want to talk about the tendency whenever there is a major spike in the price of oil for many people, including actually very often led, unfortunately, by some environmentalists, that we should go ahead and tax away all the windfall profits from these oil companies. What we mean by this is very simply the following. The idea really came about only as a result of the major oil crisis in the 70s, whereby we were producing oil, just to use figures, and I didn't double check these figures, but let's assume, more or less they are accurate, but let's assume that we were producing oil profitably at $20 a barrel. After the Iranian Revolution, oil was over $40 a barrel. So the company that was making profits at 40 is obviously going to be making tremendous profits at 40. Furthermore, what's happened is that very many of the marginal oil fields and oil wells that were mothballed, that were not in production because they could not be, the oil could not be extracted from them at 20 profitably, they started extracting oil from them again at 40. As the price of oil goes up, the number of fields that become economically feasible to go ahead and exploit is going to increase. And so very many people said, we should go ahead and tax away this particular price from the old oil wells. If you had an oil well that you were willing to exploit at $20, and right now the price artificially has increased to $40 as a result of the Iranian Revolution at the time in 1978, and the price of oil hit $40 in Amsterdam in 1980, then the government should be willing to go ahead and tax $20 for every single barrel of oil over here. That's to say, to take away that particular windfall profit. Now, what I want to show you in this, and that's why it's very important, just in case we have another such oil crisis, is that it doesn't work. It's not worth it. Now, look at this diagram, and look closely. Let me see if I can bring it a little bit closer, the diagram. Okay, so right now I think this is probably as close as it can get. Yeah. Now this diagram appears to be complicated. It really is the diagram that I just drew. However, two of them superimpose on each other. So let me try and explain this very carefully. We're going to assume that this over here is the demand curve in the United States. So this is roughly this. We're going to say right now that this has a marginal revenue. So this is the marginal revenue. So this demand curve is going to have a marginal revenue. But not the US demand curve is going to have a marginal revenue. What is really important for us right now is that the US is an importer. So we're going to find out where is the demand curve that's facing OPEC. So this is the supply curve for the US, and this is the demand curve. So this is the supply curve for the US, and this was the demand. At this particular price here, how much would we import? Nothing. So our imports over here will be nothing, so there will be no demand for oil from OPEC. Where would the demand for OPEC really go to zero? Right over here at this price, this is where we're demanding, where we're willing to supply all our oil. So this is therefore the demand curve that is facing OPEC, which is this over here, notice. So it is this demand curve. Notice, domestic demand for the US, domestic supply. They intersect at this point, which means that here we will supply all our oil, so we will not import anything. At this point over here, we will be importing anything below this, we'll be importing everything because there are no domestic supplies. So the demand curve for OPEC is going to be this one. So if this is the demand curve, this is its marginal revenue. So one more time, ultimately what's important about this diagram is that you have a demand curve and you have a marginal revenue. Okay? Now, where is it that we're going to operate? Well, you have a marginal cost. We're going to assume that this is the marginal cost. This is, by the way, critically important because we're saying that this marginal cost is very low. And who is it that's in charge of the very lowest marginal cost? Well, it's Saudi Arabia, so it's OPEC, and that's why they can dictate. In the US, we cannot produce at this price. So over here, therefore, this is what they do. So this is the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So we go up to the demand curve, therefore this is the price. So right now it's really very simple. Let me just put it here one more time so that you'll be able to see it clearly. I am saying very simply the following. Let's assume this is the demand curve for US. This is the supply curve for the US. Therefore, we're saying that the demand curve for Saudi Arabia is going to be this. If this is the demand curve for Saudi Arabia, then this is going to be the marginal revenue, because this is the demand. It bisects this distance. And let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that we have a marginal cost over here. So where both of these are going to intersect each other, this will be the price. So the price of oil in the United States will be this high. People said, wait a minute, this is too high. Why should we go ahead and accept this? So let's go ahead and tax old oil by $20 a barrel or $30 a barrel or whatever it is. Now, those of you who might not have taken lots of micro before, all what a tax does is that it shifts the supply curve this way, upward. We will keep it over here, and the supply curve will shift upward. So right now you do exactly the same diagram that what we have done before. That's why the diagram looks complicated. So this is going to be the supply curve. Therefore, the demand curve facing OPEC is going to become different. Therefore, we're going to have another marginal revenue. But the new marginal revenue is going to intersect the marginal cost to the left-hand side of the previous one. So you take it up to the new demand curve and you'll wind up with a higher price. So what have we done? by taxing oil, we have actually increased the price of oil. And not only increased the price of oil, who is it that's getting all of this area right now? It is Saudi Arabia. So by trying, therefore, to tax old oil in the United States, we do wind up in actually transferring money from the US to the other countries overseas. So we really are shooting ourselves in the foot because we wind up in being losers. I am not suggesting, let's make this very clear, and no economist is going to suggest, well, maybe some economists would, those who are working probably for the current administration would. No economist is going to suggest that you shouldn't go ahead and try to tax some of the windfall. We have taxed windfall before, especially during World War II, and we have done it successfully. But you do it by taxing the profits. You don't do it by taxing old oil vis-a-vis new oil. This idea, this very silly idea of saying that this oil well is old and therefore we can tax it, this oil well is new and we shouldn't tax it, is something that will backfire, that will help neither the country nor the world nor anybody else for that matter. And so we should be totally aware of this because it's a problem that we keep running across, not only in the United States, but also certain other countries. So being aware of the implications of an economic policy is extremely important to what kind of a policy we should stand for when we want to cut down on our use of a particular resource, in this case, fossil fuels, and in particular, oil. My suggestion is that that if we're really interested, and we should be, in really reducing our dependence on oil, whether it's imported or not, is besides the point. Most of us, unfortunately, are always asking for energy independence. I think we should be asking for not only energy independence, we should be asking for less dependence on the use of oil. This is to say, we should be able to go ahead and attain a switch from the exhaustible to the renewable. But attaining that switch really is going to have some very major implications when it comes to the cost, to the price. If we are to be driven only by our pocketbooks, then we are not going to be willing, let's assume, to go ahead and pay $10 a gallon. I can assure you, by the way, that it's very simple to go ahead and make a switch into the EVs. Assuming you think that the EVs are the solution, which I'm not sure that they are. But let's assume that EV is the solution. The switch to an EV is not going to take place when I can fill up my car, my ICE car, internal combustion engine, with $40 to $50. If it's going to cost me $150, that's to say if the price per gallon becomes $10, then in that particular case I will consider switching into a more efficient car or an alternative such as an EV or maybe even a fuel cell for that matter. But I've got to be willing to pay the price. If I'm not willing to pay the price, and Saudi Arabia is really counting on the fact that all of us behave in such a way that we are not willing to go ahead and take and behave except to be driven by our pocketbook.